Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Lisa Hogan, and I'm the Membership Relationship and Engagement Executive for the IMI. And I'm delighted to welcome you to not only the first webinar of 2021, but also the first IMI membership event of the year. Today's webinar is entitled A Roadmap for Resilient Leaders and will be delivered by Eibhlin Johnston. With more than 800 people having signed up for today, the word resilient is certainly resonating with a lot of us. And with the world as it is at the moment and Blue Monday having just passed us by, it's a topic that I think most of us could use some direction on. And I, for one, am certainly very interested to hear what Eibhlin will be delving into today. Eibhlin herself is an author and coach. She has previously held a range of senior roles in financial services until 2018, when she founded the Resiliency Hub. The Resiliency Hub provides resiliency coaching to executives and leaders, and Eibhlin also specialises in mental well-being, and her client base ranges from young teenagers all the way up to top executives. During this session, Eibhlin will point to some simple steps to resiliency. Over the last 10 months, our reserves have been depleted, and yet many of us continue to attempt to work at the same levels that we had previously operated at. Today, Eibhlin will share what has worked for her and her many clients. And remember, these are tips, not a substitute for what is already working for you, but will hopefully be some additions that you can add in to further support you. Just some housekeeping before Eibhlin starts the session. The webinar will, as usual, be recorded and shared with you shortly afterwards as part of our on-demand content, and members will also be able to access this via the Knowledge Centre. So we will have time for a short Q&A section at the end with Eibhlin, and the Q&A portal will be manned by both myself and my colleague Della during the session. So if there are any questions you would like to ask throughout the webinar, please do post these as we go, and we will capture these and endeavour to answer as many as possible. And Eibhlin has also kindly agreed to follow up with any that we don't get to today. Just one small note, we will not be using the raise hand function. So if you do have a question for myself or Della, please post it into the Q&A portal as well. So without further ado, over to you, Eibhlin.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm assuming you can hear me.
Yes, all good.
Perfectly. Thank you. And now, before we start today, I'm just going to ask you to do a very simple thing. Just turn around. You can stand up and turn around, or just turn around on your seat and just notice something in the room that you're in, or the space that you're in. Really notice something. Notice something that you haven't seen before. And just take a minute to observe it. Now, I do apologize if you're at home and you've noticed a crack in the wall or a stain in the wallpaper, because you won't be able to unsee this. Noticing is one of the key elements for resilient leaders. Now, for those of you who actually didn't turn around, it's okay. But why don't you ask yourself why you didn't turn around? What else was going on in your mind at the time? What were you thinking about? What were you distracted by? Was it an email? Was it a child? Was it something that you needed to action? Was it your computer? How were you engaged in that moment when I asked you to notice? Because we all do that. We all think we are listening, noticing. But actually, a lot of the time we are in our thinking. The reason I did that exercise, which is a really simple exercise, was just to get you present, to notice you're noticing and you're listening. So just in case you're feeling a little bit out there and your mind is still caught up in your thinking, or the shock that you didn't do what you were told in the first part of this webinar, let's just take a minute now to really be present, to really listen, to really notice. Time for us to focus today. And if I do my job properly and you're present, that would be enough. That would be the first step for resilient leaders. Noticing and listening, for me, in my experience, are the foundation of resilience. Full stop. So whilst I'm not encouraging you to leave this webinar now, if you left now, you would have learned two really important points. Noticing, listening, and being present while you're doing those two things are key and critical for resilience. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm Eibhlin Johnston. I have over 30 years experience in financial services and endless years in coaching, training, and leadership facilitation. I have 33 years experience as a parent, although if my son was listening, he'd get very annoyed because he pretends he's 29. And I have 52 years living on this planet. 52 years of resiliency. Except sometimes I forget. I am a human being, I'm a resilient being, but often I get caught up in my thinking and I forget. So that's what we're going to look at today. The roadmap for resilient leaders. During today, whilst it may look simple because I am doing this presentation with a series of post-it notes. If you could see in front of me here now, but thankfully we're in the world, we're in the virtual world, I hide post-it notes on my desk all of the time. These are my post-it notes. These post-it notes that I'm going to show you during the course of this morning or this afternoon show us how to have a deeper understanding and the latest findings on resilience. The latest finding you'll find is very simple. An ability to disrupt your current level of thinking, thereby reducing stress levels for you and your teams. So we've already done that. We've already established that just by being present and noticing disrupts our current level of thinking. We're going to give an understanding of the busy mind with clear outcomes around productivity. And then hopefully all of this together will actually provide you with your roadmap for resiliency. Now, what was curious about the word roadmap was it came out of my thinking. And when I was preparing for this webinar a couple of weeks ago, I was wondering why I used the word roadmap. But you will see. It was akin to the journey of life or the journey as a leader, which has been disrupted by the chaos that we're all living in the last 10 months. Whilst I won't delve into aspects of remote working, what I will do, however, is just pop in a few little things that I have noticed with clients. So in 2019, when I set up the Resiliency Hub, I also wrote a book called Cutthroat Leadership. And there were 7 simple chapters in it around thinking, being too busy, using our intuition, keeping change simple, love is all you need, which was actually at the time, a lot of people questioned the use of love in a leadership book, and dealing with difficult people. Now, like most of you, 2020 changed an awful lot. I have since updated that book with the resiliency element that is needed in life. So here's your first road. Have you ever been driving along the road during the day or at night, or a passenger in a car? You're tired. Your mind is all over the place. You're overthinking. You know you are probably too tired to drive. The rumble strips on the road are there to catch you. Have you ever wandered over to that side of the road? Wandered onto the rumble strips, and then you collect yourself, you notice, you observe perhaps what speed you were on, the temperature in the car. You might turn on the air conditioning, open a window, take a drink of water, but you continue. The rumble strips on the side of the road are there to remind us to notice. what is going on around us and what is going on inside us. Illness, headaches, stress, anger, frustration are all signs, warning signs, that we are given on a daily basis. A snap conversation with a loved one, dismissing a child who might be telling you something, dismissing a colleague by not actually listening or being present, cause that stress, causes us not to be resilient. But the first thing is to notice, what are the rumble strips in your life? So the next time you notice something, just remember this simple metaphor. It's crucial for me on a daily basis. Now, in the series of post-it notes that I'm going to give you today, I will give you other little signals that will bring you back to your own personal rumble strips. So resilience is the ability to withstand adversity, bounce back from difficulties, and to grow despite these difficulties. Now, what we tend to forget is that we are human beings. We're not machines. We are thinking beings. We are human beings. So just for 1 minute, take a look out a window. Hopefully there's a window near you, and just observe the nature around you. Observe the sky, trees if you can see them, the flowers, something walking by. If there's a child, observe the child. They're pure resilience. Observe the fact that nature is growing all around you. Nature is there to thrive. Nature is resilient. Unfortunately, however, we forget that we are part of nature. We are part of this ecosystem. We forget that every single thing on this planet is connected. And we detach ourselves from the pure resilience that you were born with, that you were born to thrive. Every single parent will recognize it in their child. They thrive. We talk about children like they're thriving. How is your baby? He's thriving. She's thriving. And yet at some stage, and it's never the same for everybody, we forget that. And we detach from thriving beings into thinking beings. So resilience is bringing you back to center. Now, sometimes things are so obvious. Have you ever opened the fridge and you're looking for something specific, and you open the door of the fridge and you can't find it, and somebody else comes up to the fridge, opens it, and sees it immediately? When you see something like this, that you are part of nature, that you are resilient, and that you are born to thrive, it's the exact same as opening the fridge. It is an insight, a sight from within. Now, in case I lose you, because a lot of leaders might be going into their thinking mind now and going, this isn't what I signed up for. What I'm going to do today is get you to notice. This is part of noticing. Slowing down is part of noticing. Your rumble strips on the side of the road are part of your noticing. Noticing and listening are the key steps to resiliency. So listening. Listening is one of my favorites, because 90% of leadership is listening. Most client issues that I come across when I am coaching leaders in any organization stem difficulties stem from a lack of listening or a lack of communication. And that's why both of these points are going to be covered today. Because in order to have that roadmap, to have that toolbox, listening is critical. 90% of your leadership is listening. Now, last year, I was asked as a coach, how good was my listening? I was attending a course specifically around listening. Now, as a coach, I thought, my listening is fantastic. I'm an excellent listener. And I was asked very quickly, how would your children describe you as a listener? And to my shame, I reflected. I reflected on those 33 years of parenting, and I noticed my lack of listening. I noticed when my mind was not there. I noticed that I was not a good listener. I noticed that when I was reading storybooks, my mind was elsewhere. I was thinking about something else. So pure, true listening is really being present. Like you listen to music. If you love music, I love music. When I listen to music, I'm really listening. Now, there are times that when I listen to a song and it brings me somewhere, I have to bring myself back to truly listen. On that same course, we did triads and breakout sessions. If we had the luxury of time today, we could do that, where somebody was the listener, somebody else was the observer, and somebody else was the coachee. What was fascinating when we did different types of listening was how we felt as the person who was being listened to or wasn't being listened to. Now, what do I mean by that? We did a little check at the end, a little poll. What did it feel like to be listened to? Curious, some of the words were loved, listened to, supported, important. That's what it felt like to be listened to. We asked, what did it feel like not to be listened to? Offended, offensive. There were questions like not important enough, unworthy, vulnerable. They were such strong words. And yet we as leaders on a daily basis have our minds in different places and do not focus 100% on listening. Now, why is listening important to resilience? Well, resilience requires you to be listening to both other people and yourself. Because if you're truly listening, you're not missing out on bits of conversations and you can action things quicker. You also hear what's going on with your staff. But also, when you are listening to yourself and your thoughts. And it's really important to observe your thoughts, because an accumulation of stressful thoughts, overwhelming thoughts, negative thoughts about what somebody is doing or not doing, that will impact your resiliency. So your takeaway for this post-it, should you choose to have it on your desk on a daily basis, is when you are listening, what do you want that other person to feel? Vulnerable, uncared for, or loved, connection, and worthy? I know which one I want to feel. On a similar vein, communication is equally as important. Today, communication is absolutely vital. We're communicating like this all of the time. And some of us are hiding behind cameras. We're hiding behind masks. But what I always point out is that we've been doing this for an awful long time. This is not something that's new for the last 10 months. My previous role in JP Morgan was a EMEA-based role, none of my team were based in Ireland. I guarantee you many of you have remote teams, even before the COVID environment. And we communicated like this. How many times have you been on a meeting or leading a meeting and you're multitasking? Well, I'm going to break that myth. There is no such thing as multitasking. It comes back to being present, just as I described earlier. So if you can imagine you're communicating with somebody, I bring up the windscreen. This is the simplest metaphor that I have and use with clients when I am talking about communication. So you're driving your car and you're driving along. Your car can represent the activities you're doing in the workplace or even your personal life, but you are driving along. And this is your windscreen. Your windscreen is blurred. Your windscreen is a metaphor for your thinking. So when you are communicating with somebody, and I am communicating with somebody, I always have my own windscreen, which is blurred with my own thinking, my own judgment, my own unconscious bias, my own history, my own stories. All of that, when I'm communicating with somebody, is represented by that blurred windscreen. How can I, as a human being, communicate with somebody if all of that thinking is in the way? Now, yes, you can learn how to reduce your thinking, and we will talk about slowing down. But just knowing this is critically important for effective communication and then effective resilience. Because once we start communicating better, we become less stressed about conversations that we have with people. So just imagine you're having a conversation through your windscreen, and your windscreen is blocked with your thinking, your unconscious bias, your judgment, your history. You're thinking about a particular project or a conversation that you're having that you will have prepared for, or perhaps you haven't. Just remember that the person you are speaking to is also driving towards you with their own windscreen, which is also blurred by their thinking, their habits, their own stories, their judgment. How do you think we can communicate as human beings and have effective communication if this is what's going on all of the time? Just knowing this means you can ask a simple question after a conversation. It's so simple. What did you hear there? I do that when I do trainings, virtual trainings. What did you hear there? And people get so caught up in their thinking that they don't hear because they're not listening. They're not aware. This is very difficult to practice because how we communicate with ourselves and our stories also gets caught up in this communication. So what do I mean by our stories? I know it's not me, but I can embellish stories about my life, about a person in my life, about a piece of work, about a project, about all of the things that will, can, and have gone wrong. And I can create the most dramatic stories. I'm pretty good at that until I notice. So that is part of my windscreen. And I like to think the noticing is the windscreen washer, that I'm starting to clear that. But regardless of what we do, try and start your conversations and your communication knowing that there is diluted listening, knowing that there is hazy thinking, and making sure that what is said is what is heard. It is so simple, and yet we forget it because we get caught up in our thinking. So you heard me talking about our stories. When I talk about stories, I mean my own personal stories, but also who I'm communicating with. Now, I'm smiling because this post-it is on my desk 24/7. My mantra for the last year, since I started really focusing on resilience in myself and as a leader, my mantra has been less commas, more full stops. In the work I do with people, I get them to notice their stories, observe the thinking in the stories, observe the fictional characters in their stories, because most of the stories are created through your own personal thinking. He said that and he did that and she didn't do that, and I know it's because they were thinking that about that and they assumed that I knew. They are the types of language and words that we hear when we create stories. Now, we all create stories. It's part of being human. So we can't remove that story from us. But actually, when you're communicating in a resilient way with yourself first, remember, less commas, more full stops. Now, it might be a little bit cheeky, but when I'm coaching people, particularly in Zoom environment, I tend to, at times, when somebody gets carried away in their story, but is unaware of it, it's that awareness. I go back to the noticing and listening that I described at the very beginning when I got you to turn around. It's that awareness and noticing. So what I do is I put my sticky in front of the camera and it says full stop. And it is remarkable how many people go, oh God, yeah, I forgot. Oh God, I was doing it again. Oh, I was repeating that story again. These stories don't serve us. That is what causes the chaos, the overwhelm. I did one recently. Last Monday, I created a story about something personal in my life. And I was about to launch into this spectacular story. And I was just about to walk into my husband and tell him the story. But in the time that it took me to walk from my office into the kitchen, I had said, full stop. I knew I was embellishing every part of that story with my own thinking. And regardless of what I thought about the particular story or the scenario, it wasn't real. It was made up by my thinking. So instead of getting distracted and overwhelmed by those stories and my thinking of what was right and what was wrong, and what did somebody say, what were they going to say, I settled my mind. And that was my key. My morning shifted in 1 minute. I threw this post-it in at the very last minute because this is part of our story. We tend as leaders to live life on a post-it note. Now, many of us think beyond that, but we tend to put boundaries and restrictions. And that's okay. But if we are to thrive and expand, We need to see what is real. So I put this up. What are the real life limitations? Now, obviously, COVID is one of them. But there are so many limitations that we put on ourselves. There are so many limitations. The problem is one of those sentences that I banned in my last job. I ban. The problem is. The solution is. Because if we delve into problems, of course we're going to find limitations. It's part of what a problem is. Slowing down. Have you ever got up and from a situation where you were so caught up in finding a solution? You might have been working with a team. You're all involved in a meeting room back in the olden days when we could sit in meeting rooms. Or you're all on Zoom and you're concentrating on finding a solution to a problem. And you get up and you go to make a cup of tea or you go to the bathroom. And in that moment, the answer comes to you. Now, that happens quite regularly. In fact, one of my expressions was, I always do my best thinking when I make a cup of tea. That wasn't true. I always come up and find the solution when I stop or slow down. Because when you're going too fast, your mind is racing and you forget that in that silence or that split second of shifting, even in your chair or making the cup of tea, that is what slowing down is all about. Slow down in your listening, slow down in your thinking, slow down in how you actually do things, in the time that it takes to do things. It's amazing how much more you get done when you slow down. Now, life throws us so many signs for us to slow down. And many times if you snagged a toe, ripped something, for the ladies here, ripped your tights in the morning when you're rushing. How many times have you forgotten something because you haven't slowed down? That is equally applicable as a resilient leader. Because when you slow down, you notice. My life was always too fast. And that's why this learning has been incredible. And what I've really noticed with clients is that we all loved the first lockdown. We observed nature. We liked that pace. There was a novelty. And so quickly, we were looking to get back to normal. And now we find ourselves in our third lockdown. And yet we are still looking back instead of actually looking forward and taking this slow pace, this slower pace, and enjoying it. And for the parents amongst you, and I sound sometimes as if I'm preaching, and I really don't mean that. If I could have my 3 children sitting, homeschooling with me, not actually having to race out and scream and shout because I was going to be late for a meeting because the traffic was going to be heavy. If I could get back all of that chaos in the mornings that I created for my children, I would do it in a heartbeat. You have an opportunity to actually create a life that works, to actually create teams that work, to create more productivity in your teams just by slowing down. So that leads me nicely to the busy mind. Changing your mind and you change your performance. We all have a similar concept of time. We all think that this 1 hour webinar is 1 hour. Some people may find that this is going really fast. Other people may go, wow, I need to go and make that cup of tea to quieten my mind or shift. I'm not going to be insulted either way with my thinking. But an hour, although it's 60 minutes, has a different time span or feel to so many different people. A minute is different to so many people. One way to prove this is try and do a plank for 5 minutes, and you will really see how long 5 minutes is. And yet 5 minutes is so quick in life. The difficulty in using time as a measurement for any activity that we're doing in the workplace or anywhere for that matter is that we all have different perceptions of time. What may take you 20 minutes to do might take somebody else an hour to do. And you can see where there is a miscommunication there, and actually how somebody's mind can get so busy and caught up that we create the term procrastination. Now, I have discussed procrastination with so many people, particularly leaders. Procrastination is one of the biggest stressors in life. Procrastination, really, if we were describing it to an alien that just plonked in here in front of me, is actually overthinking something that I need to get done within a certain deadline. And the alien might turn around and say, why are you overthinking it? Do you not just do that task? And your simple response could be a number of things. I don't know what I'm actually supposed to be doing. I don't believe what I am doing is relevant or that is important. I just haven't in the right frame of mind. I'm worried that what I will do will not be right because I didn't hear the instructions correctly. I am way too busy to do this now. All of those things are procrastinators. They are caught up in our busy minds. What's interesting, however, is when I dissect particular situations with clients, it tends to be their thinking. And a lot of it tends to be made up. Now, for 1 second am I taking from the reality of deadlines. Not for 1 second am I taking away the importance of managing teams who actually have operational deadlines or who have targets. None of that has been taken away. What we are looking at is a mechanism to reframe our thinking or to reduce the thinking through less commas and more full stops. So performance. We have typically operated on a performance around productivity. And it has come from years and years. It comes from industrial revolutions. It comes from productivity and output. It comes from productivity of how much you produce. Productivity in typical examples now is measured about how busy somebody appears or seems to be. What's difficult now for leaders and managers in remote environments is we can't actually gauge that level of productivity. And it has increased our thinking around how productive somebody is. Performance is equal to your capacity as a leader or a team member minus interference. Interference is what we just spoke about. Interference is also homeschooling. Interference is also COVID. Interference is also stress. Interference is also an unburdensome workload. It is the thinking of all of those things that actually grows and exasperates that interference. So if we turn and look at output as being the gauge of performance at the moment, We don't have to have the same time frame that we have worked to in the past. Now, I'm going to give you an example. And I don't think there's one person in this seminar that would not remember a time back in the olden days, the day before you went on holidays. For me, it was the most productive and efficient day of work that I ever had. Nothing got in the way. There was no interference. My thinking about was something good enough, or could I do that, or should I have a meeting with somebody? They all disappeared. I was focused on the outcome. I was focused on the output. I was focused on getting on holidays. If I had been able to replicate my output on a day before I went on holidays, 5 days a week, every week, I would have been incredibly performing at an incredible pace. But it's the only time that I can recall not having that interference was when there was something that was really pressing. Now, I call that living in the flow. I call that being in the flow. When I am so focused that I am driving along straight in that car on my own road, unaware and not conscious of what's going on around me because I am so focused. Now, if you're managing teams, you don't have the luxury of that at all stages. But what you do have the luxury of is having effective conversations with your team to actually understand what is going on. What is their performance like? How do they operate? What is their capacity? What is their interference? Those are simple conversations, because that's where we become more resilient. When we name what that interference is, we can deal with it through coaching or other means. When we don't name it, we don't understand what's going on in the minds of our staff, or even in your own minds, or your peers, or your stakeholders, or the board of directors, or any person that you're dealing with on a daily basis. What happens is this comes back into our family life as well. We all observe that. I always remember a situation after a particularly stressful day where I came home and my kids were playing football on the green. And I came home and there were dirty dishes on the table. Now, instead of actually appreciating that my kids were outside, that they weren't watching the television, I went nuts. I'm not proud of it. Anybody who lived within a 20-kilometre radius of Blackrock, County Dublin would have heard me. I was not annoyed with my kids or the bowl. I was caught up in my head, my stress, but I needed to take it out on somebody. And who better than an innocent child? Now, they could have cleaned the plates, but my level of stress, anxiety, and anger was disproportionate to what had happened. But I had held it together. That's like the rumble on the road. When you notice, really notice. This is my second last slide. Last weekend, I spent 4 days doing a masterclass in coaching, which I absolutely loved. And one of the tips that somebody spoke about was his own personal jetpack. Now, I loved this because I really saw something new. I was listening and I noticed. He described how when he was in helper mode as a coach, he was thriving. He had an abundance of energy. He felt he was in the flow all of the time. As leaders, that's how we feel when we are thriving, when things are working well, when we are bringing a team with us to achieve a result, when we are hitting our targets, that's how we feel as leaders. He called that helper fuel. I love that terminology, because when we're really in our own flow, we're thriving on helper fuel. But what I loved about this analogy, which is slightly off-road and more space, was his personal fuel. He said it's a separate tank, and that's when I saw it. If it's a separate tank, we need to observe that tank as well. So we can be all buzzed up and energized by what's going on that's working well, whilst we might be depleting our reserves in our personal life. So homeschooling, not eating the right foods, not exercising, not seeing people that we love, not being able to engage on the level, missing people, death, all of the things that are happening in our life now, that personal fuel level can really start to reduce. But if we're in Thriver and our helper fuel is actually thriving and the throttle's going, we don't notice. And sometimes we only notice on a Friday night. That's the time when helper fuel is deactivated and we're left with personal fuel and we feel diminished. We feel flat. Now, the other thing I like about this is it gets me to notice when I'm thriving and have that energy, I know I'm in my flow. That is what is effortless for me. When I feel stuck or my personal fuel feels low and I'm challenged by something, then I notice I'm not in the flow. And that's why I have added the personal jetpack. Because my helper fuel sometimes overtakes my personal fuel and I don't notice. So again, I'm going back to noticing and listening. But this time it's listening to myself. So the roadmap for resiliency, which you can use within your organization. So what does yours look like? I tried to keep this simple. It's a series of Post-its. Pick which Post-its you think will work for you. Listen back over this webinar and just take one thing, maybe two. All of this information has been added into the updated Cutthroat Leadership, which is available on Amazon. What is really important, however, is even just to take these Post-it notes and just take those and lead yourself with your own personal resilience. For me, it's listening and slowing down and full stop. They're critical for me. And on that note, I will say full stop. I know that there are questions. I'm going to hand back over now and ask Lisa to join us. Lisa will share these slides so you'll have contact details. Thank you, Lisa.
Oh, no, thank you, Eibhlin. That was a really, really excellent session. I must say, I'm not one of these people that embraces the mindfulness culture. I found certainly before COVID, it had become very kind of almost commercialized, a lot of buzzwords around. So it was never something I gravitated towards. And I think I'd say a lot of people are probably a bit like me as well, where in this world we live in at the minute, we are forced to recognize we have to start looking at.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And I must say, I loved the way you positioned it, more about the self-awareness. I loved how you tied the personal resilience side into the supporting the people around you and your teams. And I loved that holistic view you gave, that it's not just about resiliency and living in the moment. It's also about good communication and, just being very self-aware of how you interact with people. And I think, any relationship, or whether it's personal or private, professional, could really benefit from that kind of activity.
Yeah.
And it obviously helps people thrive in a normal world,
Yeah.
but helps people survive in
That's
this
it.
world.
Yeah.
Really loved the visualization of the rumble strips as
Yeah.
warning signs. And I have to say, I did get up and look out the window at the beginning for the nature. It's been something I haven't managed to do at all today. So from myself personally, thank you so much for a really lovely session. We have some questions coming in, as I think not only myself realizes that it's something we all need to focus on. Just even before we get into the questions, just a lovely little comment here from Colin. He said, great ideas and excellent opportunity for a reset. And I think Colin there just kind of summarized it a bit better than I was trying, what I was doing. It was a reset session, and I think we all needed that. So there is a couple of other questions. We just have time. I'm going to maybe do 2, potentially 3 if we get to it. And I know, Eibhlin, that you said that you would follow up with anyone's one. So we'll send them the answers to the questions directly out to anybody who we don't get to today.
Yeah.
Just to remind everyone, it is recorded. It will be sent out to everyone who registered today. Members will be able to get it through the Knowledge Centre. And I would recommend that you share it with your colleagues that you think would benefit from it. So please feel free to engage with the content afterwards. As Eibhlin said, even rewatch it yourselves for a few points. And Margarita said she loves the jetpack post as well. That's all the lovely ones that, the lovely feedback I'm going to get cracking into the questions before we run out of time. So Colette wants to know, could you give a short example of what you would consider a full stop?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to have to give a real story then.
Great.
So I have an older sister who tends to tell me what to do. She is 10 years older than me, but we still have that role in the family. And I'm using this example because it's a naive, simple example. But what happens to me when she starts telling me what to do, I literally morph back into the 5, 6, 26, 36-year-old that has listened to this through my own lens, like that windscreen of I know what to do myself and she shouldn't tell me what to do. All of those things happen to me. But when I notice that dialogue going on in my head, I just go, enough, full stop. Now, because there are so many people on this call, there is another song that I sing to myself as well, which is enough is enough is enough. So if anybody knows that song, I am not singing it here because it'd be recorded. But that's a real example. Now, take that to a work situation and you're asked to pop into somebody's office. What happens? We get caught up in this narrative instantly. We reflect back on the last time we were in the office. What have I done? Quick scan. What did I do wrong? How come they want to talk to me? What's going on? We don't even know when we're making up unbelievable futures that we've no idea. That's where full stop really helps as well. I hope that explains it.
Excellent. Well, actually, it had helped me as well because as the older sister on the other side of that, who reverts back to a teenager at the drop of the hat with such
That's it. I hope my sister's not listening. I think you're great.
Well, I'll certainly start remembering that as well, not just in a professional environment.
That's it.
I'm going to ask one more question. Just must squeeze it in because I want to quickly run through 1 or 2 events that are coming up as well. Paul wants to know, what would you say to a leader who is still trying to navigate the challenges of managing a remote team through COVID, and now that the government is introducing a remote working policy? That's one that probably impacts a lot of people on the call.
Yes, it's a great question. So there are 2 parts to that. So when we are in a remote environment, we literally lift our current behaviors, our current boundaries, and our operating system that we use in our own head around leadership. And we have shifted it to the home environment. The only difference is the screen. There's very little difference. There's tactile things that happen in an office, and there are more ad hoc conversations. But unfortunately, we zone in on the fact that we're not having them instead of actually putting the time and effort into actually creating different ways of doing it. So I'd run things like water cooler events, online events, checking in with people. It's so easy to check in with somebody, even a personal text. My son works for an organization where they check in just by text. It's really simple. Now, if you're a leader who leads, a team of 400 people, you're thinking I'd be up all night texting people, then you find what's relevant. But one of the little tips that I think really works is to have resiliency buddies. So even if it's a mentoring scheme or something that you bring into the organization, a resilience buddy to check in. If you don't have the capacity to check in with everybody on your team, bring it down 2 layers. Get 2 layers down. Check in what's happening 2 layers down through other means. Now, in relation to the remote working, there are 2 options here. One is you park it and you push it down the road until it actually becomes real. But the other is that you actually just face it. You have conversations with the staff. You set up a remote working work group within your organization. Bring in external facilitators. Have those conversations with your teams. Find out if there was an option, who would be interested. So know in advance what you're looking at. Because part of what we do, again, back to the stories, Lisa, is imagine if we're a leader in an organization, you're thinking, oh, here we go, remote working becoming the long term. I don't think I can deal with this. And all of a sudden you have actually identified all of these people that you would put into the remote bucket because of your thinking, but you never asked the question. You made assumptions around it. So start the dialogue. Communication is really critical. And it's the biggest thing that comes up when I'm coaching executives and leaders. It really is. So I hope that helps and answers it.
Wonderful. I'm sure it did. And I think you could also kind of summarize the main key takeaway from today as well, is around that idea of communication and active listening and actually hearing what it is people are saying to you. Before we wrap up today, I would just like to thank Eibhlin one more time for a really wonderful session. And I'd also like to thank all of you for your interest, time and attention today. And hopefully we'll see you back soon for another IMI membership event. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.